I'm Sally, your host. Welcome to my Masters Chess channel, the third board. In this video, I will show you the conclusion of the game played between the 6th world champion, Mikhail Botvinnik, and the Soviet-Ukrainian Grandmaster, Isaac Boleslavsky, in 1943, Sverdlovsk, Russia. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you watch it first. Just click the link above. If your device does not show the link, you can access part 1 through links my master made available in this video description and in the comments section. So, let's continue the game. As we watched in the last video, in this position, Mikhail Botvinnik had white and played Queen to h3, threatening to play Pawn to g5. As I said in part 1, I decided to limit Black's choices to only 2 moves. There are more moves of course, but analyzing all the variations would be beyond the scope of this video, and you would get sleepy, wouldn't you? Black's candidate moves are King to h7 and Knight to f7. According to Stockfish, Black's position is better, and the correct move would keep his advantage. In part 1 I used the expression, save the game. It was too dramatic on my part. I correct myself and apologize here. The other move, although is not going to bring immediate defeat, is a mistake. Which one is the correct move? If you wish to study this position, pause the video now. According to Stockfish, the best move in this position is King to h7. And after that, the game could continue like this. Pawn to g5. F takes on g5. H takes on g5. Bishop takes on g5. Queen to h2. Now that the rook is not pinned anymore, white threatens to take the bishop. Bishop to d8. Queen to g3. Queen to g6. And according to the engine, Black would be better. Let's return to the game. After Queen to h3, Boleslavsky plays Knight to f7. He probably wanted to protect the g5 square with his knight. But this was not the move that the position required. Playing knight to f7 was a mistake, because it allows white to execute a combination, which although will not bring immediate victory, it will change the position completely with advantage for white. Can you see the combination? If you wish to try to find it, pause the video now. Botvinnik plays Bishop takes on f6. Black continues with Bishop takes bishop. Knight takes bishop check. Pawn takes knight. Rook takes on f6. White is not only threatening the queen. He also threatens to take the knight, forcing the exchange of 2 rooks for the queen. Although in many positions 2 rooks are better than a queen, this is not such a position. Boleslavsky plays Queen to d7, allowing the exchange. However, it was better to move the queen to b3, avoiding the trade. One possible continuation is Rook takes on f7. Rook to c1. Pinning the f1 rook. Queen to e3. Queen takes on f7. Queen takes on c1. Queen to g7. And white would still be better, but not by much according to the engine, perhaps because the black queen would still be on the board. Let's return to the game. White continues with rook takes knight. Queen takes rook. Rook takes queen. King takes rook. Stockfish evaluates this position as better for white, probably because black cannot defend himself against double checks, and the remaining black pawns could be easily lost. On the other hand, black still has many resources. 2 rooks, when active and well coordinated, can be superior to 1 queen. Boleslavsky still can equalize this game if he improves his rook's position. Botvinnik continues with g5. Opening the diagonal for the queen. Botvinnik starts a maneuver that will improve the queen's position at the expense of the black king. He will also win the b5 pawn. Black continues with pawn takes pawn. Queen to f5 check. Of course, retaking the pawn immediately would be a blunder, because of rook to h8, winning the queen. The game continues. King to g7. King to e7 was good too. Queen takes on g5 check. King to h7. Queen takes on b5. White wins the pawn, but the white king's position is weaker now, and this will give Boleslavsky opportunities of counter-attack. Before queen takes on b5, white should have played queen to h5 check, forcing the king to return to the g-file. And after, queen takes on b5. Rook to g8. Aiming to control the king's knight file, and limiting the white king's mobility. But the rook is blocked by his own king. Queen to g5. King to h7. Queen to h5 check. King to g7. Maneuvering his queen in order to keep the king blocking the rook. King to h2. And white would be better. In the actual game, after queen takes on b5, white's positional advantage is reduced. Black continues with rook to f8. The wise fish favors rook to g8. Queen to d7 check. King to g8. Queen to e6 check. King to g7. Queen to d7 check. King to g8. As you may have noticed, white and black repeated their moves here. In his book, 100 Selected Games, Botvinnik did not explain why he and Boleslavsky repeated their moves, but I think it was because of the tournament time control. Some beginners probably do not know, but at the time of this game, it was common for serious tournaments to have time controls of 40 moves in 2.5 hours. Perhaps they had little time left to complete their first 40 moves in the time limit determined by the tournament, and wanted to trigger the additional time rule. Let's return to the game. After king to g8, white continues with king to g2. This, according to Stockfish, was a mistake. Botvinnik probably wanted to advance his king, before black plays rook to c2, locking the white king in the first rank. However, this move equalizes the game according to the engine. It was better to take the d6 pawn. The game could have continued in many ways. One variation is this. Rook to c2. Threatening mate with rook to f1. King to g1. Avoiding it. Rook to f7. It would be a blunder to play rook from f8 to f2. White would respond with queen to g3 check, and trade the queen for the two rooks, with a winning pawn endgame. By playing rook to f7, black threatens to play rook to g7 check, and after the king moves, black would play rook to g2. Let's return to the variation. After rook to f7, white could continue with queen to d5. And white would be better, but not by much according to the engine. Another variation starts after king to g1. In this position, black could also take the b2 pawn. The game could continue this way. Queen to g6 check. King to h8. Queen to h5 check. King to g8. Queen takes on a5. But white would be better according to the engine. Let's return to the game. After king to g2, Boleslavsky continues with rook to c2 check. King to g3. Rook from c to f2. Since his other rook is necessary on f8 to defend the king, Boleslavsky wants to bring this rook to f7, and then to g7. After that, he can give checks on the white king, while protecting his king with his rooks. But according to Master Fish, it was better to play rook takes on b2. If white took the d6 pawn with the queen right now, the game could continue like this. Rook to b7. Threatening rook to g7. Queen to d5 check. Rook from b to f7. d4. a4. e5. a3. e6. Rook to f3 check. King to g2. And we would have a draw. Let's return to the beginning of this variation. After rook takes on b2, instead of taking the d6 pawn right now, it would be better for white to maneuver the queen. The game could continue like this. Queen to g4 check. King to h8. Queen to h5 check. King to g8. Queen to g6. King to h8. Queen takes on d6. Taking the pawn with a tempo because the queen also threatens the f8 rook. Rook from b to f2. Queen to h6 check. And according to Stockfish, white would be better, but not by much. Note that black's passed pawn would be a headache for white. Let's return to the game. After rook from c to f2, white continues with queen takes on d6. Rook from f2 to f7. Black threatens to play rook to g7 check. If white is careless, and plays something like pawn to e5, the game could continue like this. Rook to g7 check. King to h3. Rook to f3 check. King to h2. Rook to f2 check. And we would have a draw. Let's return to the game. Well, according to Stockfish, by playing rook to f7, the Ukrainian player made a decisive mistake. If you wish to analyze this position, pause the video now. After queen takes on d6, it was better to play king to h7. After that, one possible variation is queen to c7 check. Rook from f8 to f7. Queen takes on a5. Rook from f2 to f3 check. King to g4. Rook takes on d3. Queen to h5 check. King to g8. Queen to b5. Rook to d1. And white would still be better, but not by much. However, after rook to f7, the game becomes very difficult for black. Botvinnik continues with queen to d5, pinning the rook. King to h8, unpinning and freeing the g-file for the rook. Black wants to play rook to g7, followed by rook to f3 aiming for perpetual check. But there is a one problem now. Botvinnik plays e5. Now the white queen protects the f3 square. And because the last black pawn is not a passed pawn, black cannot play rook to f3 check, allowing the trade of pieces, since the resulting pawn endgame would be lost. Black continues with rook to g7 check. King to h3. Rook to g6. Threatening to win the e-pawn if the white continues with pawn to e6. One possible continuation is rook to e8. Pawn to e7. King to g7. h5. Rook to b6. Queen to g5 check. King to f7. h6. Rook takes on e7. But after that, the position would be lost for black. Let's return to the game. After rook to g6, white plays d4. Rook to f1. Black intends to double rooks behind the white king. He also can play rook to e1, to prevent the advance of the king's file pawn. Queen to e4. Threatens the rook, and prevents rook to e1. It also protects the f5 square. Rook from g to g1. d5. Rook to h1 check. Rook to e1 was better. King to g4. Rook from h to g1 check. King to h5. Since the white queen protects the f5 square, no rook can check from there. Rook to f7. As a last attempt perhaps, Boleslavsky threatens to play rook to h7, and the white queen would have to be sacrificed to avoid the mate. White plays pawn to e6. Botvinnik does not need that queen, because soon he will have a new one. After rook to h7 check, queen takes rook, and king takes queen. The remaining black rook would not be able to avoid the promotion of one of white pawns. And that's why, after pawn to e6, Isaac Boleslavsky resigned. Did you like this game? I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want notifications of more chess games, please subscribe to this channel. That would help us make more content like this. We wish you success in your chess. Thank you, and see you again.